The tension after the evidentiary hearing only intensified, because even though the judge had not yet issued a ruling, the writing was on the wall that Karen and her circle were in serious trouble, and instead of laying low, she seemed to unravel further, storming through the neighborhood in her car, cornering people in their driveways to rant about conspiracies, handing out poorly written flyers claiming I was a danger to the environment, and even organizing a pathetic protest outside my house with a handful of die-hard supporters holding signs that said things like, "Protect our community from rogue dams," while neighbors across the street laughed and filmed them. But what rattled me was not the noise, it was the growing sense that Karen might do something reckless out of desperation, because she had already lost her grip on the HOA board. Several members had resigned outright, and others were openly cooperating with investigators, meaning the organization that had once been her fortress was crumbling around her. And she was cornered, a position that made her dangerous. Sure enough, her next move proved just how reckless she had become late one night. While my family was asleep, someone tried to tamper with the dam's control panel. I caught it on a motion-activated camera, a figure fumbling with the lock before running off when the security lights triggered. And though the video was grainy, the outline looked suspiciously like Karen's companion, a younger man she often had running errands for her. I immediately turned the footage over to the police, and within days an investigator confirmed tool marks on the lock, evidence of attempted sabotage. And that escalated everything to another level, because now it wasn't just about fines or fraud. It was about potential criminal sabotage of a piece of infrastructure that regulated water flow, which the authorities took extremely seriously. The county sheriff himself called me to assure me that the site would be monitored and that additional patrols would pass by at night, which eased my family's fears somewhat. But the realization that Karen was willing to risk flooding just to hurt me enraged me to my core. Still, as stressful as it was, the sabotage attempt backfired massively for Karen, because once the police report became public record, the last of her wavering supporters abandoned her. Neighbors who had clung to neutrality realized she had crossed into outright danger, and whispers spread about whether she might face not just fraud charges but reckless endangerment, or worse. Meanwhile, the prosecutor's office was piecing together the financial case against her, subpoenaing more records, interviewing contractors, and digging into years of HOA fines that had mysteriously disappeared from the official ledger. And every leak that came out of that process painted a darker picture, suggesting Karen and her allies had siphoned off tens of thousands of dollars under the guise of community improvements that never materialized. The pressure showed on her face when she appeared in court again. Gone was the smug smile, replaced with pinched anger, as Priya systematically presented new evidence of misuse. But it was outside the courtroom where the community really began to shift the HOA board. Desperate to save face, voted to suspend Karen from her role as president pending the outcome of the investigation, something nobody had ever thought possible. And neighbors began openly discussing reforms, proposing a new charter with strict financial transparency rules, term limits, and even the possibility of returning some autonomy to homeowners rather than letting the board micromanage everything. Conversations that would have been unthinkable just months before. For my family, life was still tense, but improved. We no longer felt like pariahs. People waved when they passed by. And kids who once avoided our yard came over to play near the creek, yet I never let my guard down, because I could feel Karen's fury radiating from across the subdivision. Her blinds drawn tight, her yard neglected, her once busy house now quiet except for the occasional visit from her lawyer. And I knew she was plotting something, though I didn't know what. That what revealed itself in shocking fashion during one final, desperate act. Karen staged a dramatic press event in her yard, inviting a local tabloid-style news crew and a handful of loyalists, where she declared that the dam was unsafe. Waving around fake documents she claimed proved I had violated environmental codes. She shouted into the cameras about how the state had failed to protect the community, and then, as if to prove her point, she marched the crew down the road toward the dam and tried to trespass onto the property itself, only to be intercepted by deputies who had been stationed nearby. The confrontation was caught on film, Karen screaming at officers as they calmly escorted her away. And when that footage hit the evening news, it destroyed whatever shred of credibility she had left. The story no longer framed her as a concerned resident, but as an unstable woman whose obsession had spiraled completely out of control. And in the days that followed, the prosecutor filed formal criminal charges against her: fraud, embezzlement, attempted sabotage, and obstruction. The neighborhood, once so fractured, now seemed united in relief. People who had avoided conflict finally spoke openly about the fear Karen had instilled in them. And as I listened to their stories, I realized just how many lives she had disrupted with her petty fines, her power plays, and her relentless bullying. It wasn't just me she had targeted. It was nearly everyone at one point or another. And with her empire finally collapsing, there was a sense that the neighborhood was healing at last. Though I knew the saga wasn't over yet because the trial loomed, and with it the possibility of Karen finally facing the kind of accountability she had escaped for far too long. When the police finally showed up at my door, it was less of a surprise and more of an inevitability. Because Karen's accusations always escalated into official attention whether they deserved it or not. Yet instead of being rattled, I felt strangely calm, since I had been keeping careful records in anticipation of just this kind of stunt. And as Officer Ramirez sat down in my kitchen with a notebook and weary eyes, I slid across the folder I had prepared weeks earlier containing inspection reports, dam maintenance logs, photographs of the sluice system, and even statements from neighbors who had witnessed the overflow channel working exactly as intended. The officer studied everything with a seriousness that reassured me and asked pointed questions about how the dam operated, how long it had been in my family, and what safeguards were in place. And when I showed him video footage of the water release during Karen's party, complete with the measured surge and gradual tapering that caused nothing more than inconvenience, he leaned back in his chair and said quietly, "I don't see a crime here, but I do see someone exaggerating," which was all the confirmation I needed to know. Karen's claim of reckless endangerment was going to collapse. But of course, Karen didn't stop at the police report. She immediately ran to the HOA newsletter and her personal social media, spinning the narrative into a melodramatic tale about a neighbor unleashing a torrent that endangered children and humiliated community leaders, carefully omitting the fact that her guests left with nothing more serious than wet shoes and ruined dresses. She even framed it as an attack on the mayor himself, since he had been standing on her patio when the champagne fountain tipped over in the flood. And while that kind of drama might have worked in the past, the difference now was that too many people had witnessed the truth firsthand. Dozens of them grumbling openly that Karen had brought this embarrassment on herself by scheduling a high-profile party right next to a functioning watershed. And the local news seized on the irony, airing an interview with me where I explained calmly that I had merely redirected excess water into the legal overflow channel, stressing that the system had worked safely for decades and that HOA had no authority to dictate the use of water rights they didn't own. And that report, paired with neighbors speaking on camera about Karen's history of bullying, flipped the momentum. For the first time, she was being publicly questioned instead of blindly obeyed. Still, Karen doubled down, pushing the HOA board to slap me with another fine for malicious nuisance. But by then, even the board, members who had once gone along with her theatrics, began to hesitate, whispering that her antics were drawing dangerous legal attention. And one even approached me privately to admit that they were sick of being pressured into rubber stamping whatever punishment she demanded, which gave me a sense that cracks were finally spreading through her control. Yet Karen wasn't finished. She lawyered up and filed an emergency injunction, claiming that my dam was a public hazard and should be placed under municipal supervision, a dramatic legal maneuver that initially earned her a temporary restraining order from a judge barring me from operating the sluice gates without government approval. Though what she didn't anticipate was that this tactic opened her and the HOA up to discovery. And my attorney, a sharp strategist named Priya, immediately began demanding records, meeting minutes, bank ledgers, email chains, and what emerged from that process was far worse than anything Karen had accused me of. Because the documents revealed an HOA financial system riddled with inconsistencies. Payments to contractors who never did the work, unexplained transfers, and fine collections that seemed to vanish into thin air, all pointing to a pattern of misuse that implicated Karen at the center. And when this information was presented in court, alongside sworn testimony from disillusioned board members who admitted under oath that they had been pressured into silence. The entire room shifted, murmurs spreading among neighbors who filled the benches to watch justice unfold. And even the judge, a stern woman who had no patience for theatrics, raised her eyebrows at the sheer volume of evidence. Karen, of course, tried to spin herself as the guardian of tradition and community safety, insisting that all of her actions were to protect property values and preserve order. But her evasive answers crumbled under cross-examination, especially when Priya presented emails where Karen explicitly instructed a treasurer to bury an expense so it wouldn't draw questions. And as those documents became part of the public record, even the mayor, who had once been eager to stand at her side for ribbon cutting, issued a statement, distancing himself from the HOA, stressing that his office had no involvement and supported the ongoing investigation, leaving Karen suddenly exposed without political cover. Outside the courtroom, neighbors who once avoided speaking ill of her began sharing stories with reporters about years of intimidation and arbitrary fines. And inside, the prosecutor, who had been watching quietly, announced that the case might warrant criminal charges of fraud and embezzlement, which drained the last bit of color from Karen's face. And though I hadn't expected my act of opening the dam to spiral into a community reckoning, it had undeniably done just that, pulling years of hidden abuse into daylight and showing everyone that the power Karen wielded was built on nothing more than fear and manipulation. And even though the legal process was far from over, with hearings and possible trials ahead, the tide had turned irrevocably, leaving Karen scrambling to maintain her story while her empire of control slowly unraveled under the weight of truth. The weeks leading up to the trial were some of the most surreal I had ever lived through, because while Karen had once commanded fear and authority over nearly every household in the neighborhood, she was now treated like a pariah. Her once pristine front yard filled with wilting flowers and a sagging, HOA-approved flagpole leaning awkwardly as though mocking her obsession with appearances. And while she tried to maintain some shred of dignity by marching to her mailbox in pressed slacks and oversized sunglasses, she couldn't escape the whispering neighbors, the cold stares, or the fact that half the houses displayed "Reform the HOA" signs planted defiantly in their lawns. A grassroots rebellion that never would have existed if not for her overreach. The community was changing fast, and I felt caught between relief and unease. Because though it seemed Karen's reign was finally over, the damage she had caused had left scars. Marriages strained by constant fines, families driven into debt, friendships broken by her divide-and-conquer tactics. And as people began swapping stories with me, I realized her vendetta against me had simply been the final straw in a long history of abuse that had never been fully confronted. Priya, who had become more than just my attorney and almost a trusted ally, reminded me that the courtroom was where true accountability would be delivered. But she also warned me not to underestimate Karen, because individuals with her kind of control-obsessed mindset often lashed out hardest when they knew the end was near. And sure enough, the pre-trial maneuvering became chaotic. Karen filing a barrage of motions through her lawyer, accusing me of harassment, accusing the county of bias, accusing the judge of conflicts of interest, most of which were quickly dismissed as baseless. But each one delayed the proceedings slightly, buying her more time and more opportunities to spin narratives in whatever small circles would still listen. What was remarkable, though, was how unified the community had become in opposing her antics. Because for once, it wasn't just me standing up. It was dozens of neighbors writing statements, testifying about years of abusive fines, fraudulent billing, threats of liens, and even selective enforcement of petty rules depending on who she liked and who she despised. And that collective outpouring formed a mountain of evidence that made Karen's previous denials look laughable. When the trial finally began, the courtroom was packed, not just with attorneys and witnesses, but with curious residents who wanted to see justice. The atmosphere electric. People leaning forward as though watching the climactic act of a play that had consumed their lives. And the prosecution wasted no time laying out the evidence, displaying ledgers with missing funds, contractor invoices for services never performed, photos of supposed projects that had never been completed, and even bank transfers into accounts linked to Karen's relatives. A paper trail so damning that you could see the color drain from her face with each exhibit, though she tried to maintain her composure, occasionally shaking her head as though to signal disbelief. When my turn came to testify, I described in painstaking detail how the absurd fine for owning too much water had escalated into an all-out campaign against my family, how she had attempted to block access to the dam, how she had orchestrated a smear campaign and even tried to sabotage the infrastructure itself. And though her lawyer tried to rattle me during cross-examination, suggesting I had retaliated with the flood out of malice, Priya calmly objected, pointing out the documented chain of threats, fines, and harassment that had left me no choice but to defend myself. And the jury's faces told the story. They weren't buying Karen's narrative. Other neighbors followed me on the stand, each telling their own version of the same theme. Karen had used her power as HOA president like a weapon, singling people out, fining them arbitrarily, and pocketing the money while pretending it went toward beautification projects. And the more people spoke, the clearer the pattern became. It wasn't just negligence. It was deliberate exploitation, a racket disguised as community governance. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed, the story having grown beyond a local spat into a cautionary tale about unchecked HOA power. And though I never sought publicity, I understood the value of exposure, because the more people saw how far Karen had gone, the harder it would be for her to slither away with a slap on the wrist. Still, the trial wasn't without drama, because Karen herself took the stand in her own defense. And that was when the mask truly cracked. She delivered rambling monologues about civics, loyalty, duty, and protecting standards, veered off into paranoid tangents about conspiracies between me, the county, and developers. And when pressed on the missing funds, she deflected with wild accusations, at one point shouting that the jury was biased because they were homeowners who couldn't possibly understand leadership, a meltdown that had even her own lawyer grimacing as he tried to reel her back in. The collapse of her credibility was so stark, it almost felt sad. Watching a person who had once wielded so much authority reduced to incoherent rants. But any sympathy I might have felt evaporated when I remembered the months of torment, the constant fear she had instilled in my family, and the blatant sabotage attempt that could have endangered the entire town. By the time the prosecution rested its case, it was clear Karen's empire had crumbled for good. But the real question lingered: what sentence would she face? And would it be enough to undo the damage she had inflicted, not just on me, but on everyone whose lives she had bulldozed under the weight of her false authority? The final day of the trial was unlike anything I had ever witnessed before. The courthouse buzzing with a mix of tension, anticipation, and a quiet sense of vindication that seemed to radiate from the very walls. Because for years Karen had operated unchecked, intimidating families, draining accounts, and rewriting rules to suit her whims. And now she sat in the defendant's chair looking small, her once carefully curated image of power and authority shattered, her hair disheveled, her eyes darting nervously toward the jury as though trying to read her fate before it was announced, while her supporters, what few remained, sat rigid and stone-faced in the gallery, realizing the woman they had once treated like a queen of the cul-de-sac was moments away from a reckoning. The judge entered, the jury filed in, and when the foreman read the verdict, guilty on multiple counts of fraud, abuse of power, and misuse of community funds, the room erupted in a mixture of gasps and whispers, with one neighbor even clapping before quickly stifling it. And though Karen tried to protest, her lawyer placed a hand on her shoulder to keep her seated, the reality finally sinking in that the game she had played for so long was over. The sentencing was swift and decisive: restitution to the family she had drained, removal from any position of leadership within an HOA or civic group, and a term of house arrest followed by probation, a punishment that, while not as severe as prison, carried with it the ultimate humiliation, public disgrace, financial ruin, and the stripping away of the authority she craved more than anything else. Walking out of the courthouse that day, I was greeted not with pity, but with gratitude. Neighbors shaking my hand, thanking me for standing up. families telling me that my fight had given them courage to push back against bullies in their own lives. And while I never wanted to be anyone's hero, I couldn't deny the satisfaction of seeing a community once fractured finally beginning to heal, bound together by the shared realization that they no longer had to live under Karen's thumb. Over the following weeks, a reform committee was established, made up of residents who actually cared about fairness and transparency, and for the first time in years, HOA meetings were places of dialogue instead of fear. People voting openly, decisions made democratically. No hidden ledgers or secret fines, and though challenges still remained, there was a sense of optimism I hadn't felt since moving into the neighborhood. Karen, meanwhile, became something of a ghost. Her once bustling front porch now barren, the social hub of her self-proclaimed empire reduced to silence. And while I occasionally saw her through the blinds as I drove by, pacing angrily or shouting into her phone, she was powerless. Cut off from the control that had fueled her ego. Her downfall a living reminder to everyone that unchecked power eventually consumes itself. Looking back on everything, I realized the absurdity of it all, that it had started with a fine for owning too much water, a ridiculous phrase that now seemed like the punchline of a dark joke. And yet it had escalated into a battle for dignity, justice, and the very soul of our community. And though I had at times doubted whether fighting back was worth the sleepless nights and constant anxiety, standing there in a neighborhood finally free from her shadow, I knew it had been. And yet, there was an irony I couldn't ignore. While Karen had sought to control water, rules, and people, it was water itself, rushing from the dam. That had undone her in the most poetic way possible, washing away not just her party, but the illusion of untouchable authority she had built her life on. It made me think of all the other Karens, the ones lurking in neighborhoods across the country, drunk on rules and obsessed with control. And I knew this wasn't just our story, but a warning, a testament to what happens when ordinary people finally stand up and say, enough. If you've ever lived under the rule of someone like her, you know the suffocating feeling, the endless pettiness, the way they thrive on making you feel powerless. But trust me, they are not invincible. And sometimes all it takes is one pushback, one voice refusing to be silenced, to bring the whole house of cards crashing down. And that's why I share this story with you. Because somewhere out there, another neighbor is battling their own Karen. Another family is staring down an unjust fine, and maybe, just maybe, they'll hear this and find the courage to fight back, to reclaim their peace of mind, their community, and their dignity. Because if this saga has taught me anything, it's that bullies hide behind rules, but truth and persistence can break them apart. And if you want to hear more stories of HOAs, Karens, and neighbors fighting back against injustice, make sure you subscribe to Sham Stories. Because the next one will leave you questioning just how far people will go when they think power makes them untouchable. The weeks leading up to the full evidentiary hearing felt like living in the middle of a storm that wouldn't pass. Because while the neighborhood was buzzing with whispers about Karens, financial improprieties, and the HOA's unraveling authority, she was fighting tooth and nail to regain control of the narrative. Blasting out emails warning that I was trying to destroy the community's fabric, holding emergency informational, meetings at the clubhouse where she would stand on a little podium and shout about how property values were collapsing because of a reckless neighbor with a dam. But fewer people were listening now, and many of them were simply showing up out of curiosity, arms folded, shaking their heads as she ranted. Because the documents my attorney had pulled were damning, and even the most loyal supporters couldn't ignore the numbers and receipts that clearly didn't add up. Still, Karen had never been one to admit defeat, and her tactics shifted from grandstanding to intimidation. I started noticing strange cars idling near my driveway at night, HOA notices stuck under my door, accusing me of unauthorized modifications that were clearly fabricated. In one evening, my wife came home shaken after a woman followed her through the grocery store muttering insults about how our family was ruining the neighborhood. Yet for all the stress those games caused, they backfired because they only pushed more people to my side. And the sense of solidarity in the community kept growing as neighbors who had once been silent began standing up. Like when the elderly widow on the corner, who had lived there for decades, spoke up at a board meeting and called Karen's behavior tyrannical in front of everyone. Or when parents of kids who played along the creek volunteered to testify about how the dam had never caused danger in their lifetimes. Moments like those reassured me that the truth was too strong to be buried again. The courtroom hearing itself was a spectacle. With the benches packed and even local reporters cramming into the aisle to catch every word, Priya laid out our evidence with methodical precision, explaining how the water rights had been established long before the HOA even existed, how Karen's fines were legally meaningless, and how the flood that ruined her party had been nothing more than a safe, controlled redirection through an established overflow system. Then she pivoted to the HOA's finances, walking the judge through shady transactions line by line, introducing witness after witness who described being pressured or threatened by Karen, and each statement seemed to drive the nail deeper. Because by the time the HOA's own treasurer took the stand and admitted under oath that he had signed off on invoices he knew were fraudulent because Karen told him it was for the good of the neighborhood, the room was buzzing with outrage, and Karen, sitting stiffly at the defense table, kept scowling and whispering frantically to her attorney, who looked increasingly out of his depth. On the second day of testimony, the prosecution's representative from the county prosecutor's office announced they were formally opening an investigation into possible embezzlement and fraud. In that moment broke whatever remained of Karen's image as an untouchable leader. You could almost see the shift in the audience's body language as people realized the HOA president they had feared for years might actually end up facing criminal charges. And when Karen herself finally took the stand, she tried to put on the same indignant performance she always had, declaring herself a victim of a vendetta, claiming that I had weaponized the dam to humiliate her and then fabricated accusations of corruption to discredit her. But under cross-examination, Priya cornered her with email chains, bank statements, and witness testimony that directly contradicted her words. And Karen's composure began to crumble, her answers turning into rambling non-sequiturs and angry outbursts that made even her supporters shrink in their seats. One reporter later described it as watching a queen dethroned in real time, and that phrase stuck with me because it perfectly captured the collapse of the iron grip she had once held over everyone. Outside the courtroom, the atmosphere was almost celebratory. Neighbors clustered in little groups, sharing their own experiences of Karen's intimidation and promising that once this ordeal was over, the HOA would have to be completely rebuilt from the ground up. Some even proposed dissolving it entirely, and while that was a long shot, the very fact that people dared say it out loud showed how much had changed. As for me, I felt exhausted but vindicated, because what began as a petty fine about owning too much water had grown into a reckoning that exposed the rot in our neighborhood's leadership. But I also knew Karen was still dangerous, because people like her rarely surrendered quietly, and in the days that followed she launched one more desperate offensive, holding press conferences in her backyard where she accused me of environmental crimes, sending letters to local businesses warning them that an unlicensed dam operator was jeopardizing their safety, and even trying to get the state's environmental department involved. Though that too backfired when inspectors came out, reviewed the site, and wrote a glowing report about how the dam was well maintained and posed no hazard, which I happily posted online for everyone to read, turning her last-ditch smear into proof of my diligence. But what worried me most was not the noise she made publicly. It was the quiet, simmering anger she carried privately, and I knew instinctively she would try something reckless before the final ruling came down. Because if Karen had shown us anything, it was that she would rather scorch the earth than admit defeat. And that thought kept me up at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering just how far she was willing to go before the law caught up with her once and for all. The water rushed forward with a speed that made me grip the metal railing tighter, the sound of it crashing against the channel rocks like a thunderous drumline echoing through the valley. I had grown up around this dam, knew its mechanics and strength better than most people knew their own homes, and I was certain of one thing: it would carry enough volume to disrupt Karen's precious evening without putting anyone in true danger. My grandfather had designed the overflow to redirect into natural creek beds that wound their way downhill, passing right by Karen's property before eventually dispersing into the lower wetlands. As I watched the torrent surge away from me, a knot of satisfaction settled in my chest. Karen had been poking the bear for far too long, and tonight she'd discovered that the bear bit back. I walked back toward the ridge overlooking her backyard just as the first hints of chaos erupted below. Guests at her garden party, dressed in elegant evening wear, were laughing and sipping champagne when the sound of rushing water reached them. At first, it was subtle, just a murmur carried on the wind, but within moments, it became an unmistakable roar. Heads turned toward the hedges that bordered her manicured lawn, where the creek normally trickled harmlessly. Tonight, though, it was no trickle. Tonight it came like a stampede. Water burst through the hedge line in a churning froth, spreading quickly across the grass. The band's instruments screeched to a halt, startled shouts rising from the guests as the water swallowed the dance floor. Karen's voice cut through the air, shrill and panicked. "What is happening? Somebody do something?" She rushed toward the edge of her patio, staring in horror as her garden, her pride and joy, was swallowed whole by the surge. Flower beds she had bragged about for months disappeared beneath muddy torrents, and her perfectly placed rows of chairs floated away like discarded toys. The caterer screamed as the table holding the multi-tiered cake wobbled, tilted, and then collapsed into the water with a dramatic splash. Guests scrambled, high heels sinking into the mud, silk gowns ruined, men lifting their trousers to wade toward higher ground. The once elegant atmosphere dissolved into shrieks and chaos, and I couldn't help but laugh under my breath. The mayor himself, who had been sitting at a table near the center, leapt up and yelled for order, but his voice was drowned by the shrieking flood. Karen, meanwhile, turned as red as the wine splashing into the grass as her guests abandoned her in droves. She waved her arms frantically, screaming accusations at the bewildered crowd. This is sabotage. Someone is behind this. Her gaze darted around, searching for a scapegoat. And though she hadn't spotted me on the ridge, I knew it was only a matter of time before she connected the dots. I decided to make my presence known. Calmly, I walked down the slope toward the street, approaching her backyard from the side, hands in my pockets as if I were simply strolling through the neighborhood. By the time I reached the fence, most of the guests had fled, leaving Karen knee-deep in water, clutching the remnants of her ruined decorations. She spotted me instantly. Her eyes narrowed, her face twisted in fury, and she screamed, You did this." She splashed toward me, pointing with a trembling finger. "You opened that dam, didn't you? You destroyed my event." I raised my eyebrows, feigning innocence. "Karen, are you seriously accusing me of controlling the weather? Because last I checked, water flows downhill when it rains." My sarcastic tone only fueled her rage. She lunged closer, her designer shoes sinking deep into the mud, her sequined dress drenched and ruined. "Don't you play games with me, Dawson? This is your damn water. I'll have you arrested for this." Her voice cracked, but not from fear, from desperation. The mighty queen bee of the HOA had been humiliated in front of her most important guests, and she couldn't stand it. The mayor approached then, his trousers soaked up to the knees, his expression caught between outrage and bewilderment. "Karen, what exactly is going on here? Why was this creek not properly managed?" His tone was sharp, accusatory even, and it was clear he wasn't blaming me, he was blaming her. Karen stammered, her usual composure shattered. It's his fault. He owns the dam. He did this to ruin me." The mayor turned toward me, squinting in the dim light. "Is that true?" I shook my head calmly. "With all due respect, sir, my family's dam has been here since before the HOA was even formed. It's safe, well-regulated, and inspected every year. If there's excess water, it flows through designated channels like it did tonight. Karen has been harassing me for weeks, fining me for something I legally own. She even said I had too much water on my property. I think tonight's unfortunate incident just shows how little she understands about the land she pretends to control." The mayor's expression hardened as he turned back to Karen, who sputtered helplessly, her arms flailing as if she could wave away the disaster around her. "Karen," he said sternly, "this looks very bad. I came here tonight expecting a professional, polished event. Instead, I'm standing in a flooded backyard listening to accusations about water ownership. This isn't what leadership looks like. His words struck like a hammer. Karen's mouth opened and closed without sound, her humiliation complete. As the mayor and remaining guests departed, shaking their heads and muttering under their breath, Karen collapsed onto her drenched patio furniture, seething with rage. She turned her glare back on me, her voice hoarse but venomous. You think you've won, Dawson? You think this is over? I'll ruin you. I'll take that dam away from you if it's the last thing I do. Her threats rolled off me like the water pouring down the hillside. I leaned casually against the fence, giving her a long, measured look. Karen, you can find me all you want, spread whatever rumors you like. Out at the end of the day, water flows where it wants. You can't control it, just like you can't control me. Maybe it's time you learned that. With that, I walked away, leaving her trembling with fury amidst the wreckage of her ruined evening. When I got home, my wife was waiting anxiously by the window. She ran to me, her face filled with concern. What happened? I heard shouting all the way over here. I smirked, kissed her forehead, and said, let's just say Karen's little party didn't go exactly as planned. We laughed together, the weight of weeks of harassment suddenly lighter. But deep down, I knew Karen wasn't going to let this go. Humiliation only made people like her more dangerous, more desperate to claw back their illusion of control. And as much as I relished the sight of her drowning in her own arrogance tonight, I braced myself for the inevitable retaliation. Sure enough, it came sooner than expected. The very next morning, a police cruiser rolled up to my driveway. An officer stepped out holding a folder and looking uncomfortable. Mr. Dawson, he began, we've had a complaint filed against you by the HOA president. She's accusing you of intentionally flooding her property and endangering guests at her event. I sighed, surprised, and invited him inside to talk. This was exactly what I had expected. Karen was going to turn this into a war. But what she didn't realize was that I had more than water on my side. I had the law, the truth, and the supportive neighbors who were sick of her tyranny. And this time, I was ready to fight back harder than ever. The day I received an envelope stamped with the HOAS insignia, I knew it wouldn't be good news. But I never expected the reason they gave for fining me would leave me both laughing and boiling with rage at the same time. Inside the letter, written in their pompous, self-important legal tone, they claimed I was being fined $5,000 for owning too much water. Yes. You read that right, they said. I had too much water on my property because my land backed up against the reservoir, which had been in my family for generations. I had always known Karen, the self-appointed queen bee of the HOA, had a knack for inventing absurd reasons to harass neighbors, but this was her most outrageous scheme yet. I held the letter up, read it twice, then laughed so hard my stomach hurt before the anger settled in. How could someone be fined for something as natural and permanent as the water line on their own property? But then again, this was Karen we were talking about, the same woman who once fined a neighbor for hanging wind chimes because she claimed the sound was a public disturbance. This time, though, I wasn't going to let her get away with it. And if you want to see how a smug HOA tyrant's arrogance got drowned, literally make sure you don't miss a single part of this story and subscribe to Sham Stories, because what happened next was the kind of sweet justice you only dream about until it really happens. I stormed inside and showed the letter to my wife, who shook her head in disbelief. They can't do that, she said, her voice trembling with equal parts frustration and concern. The water line has been here since your grandfather built this dam. They don't own the reservoir. Your family does. She was right. The reservoir wasn't some artificial neighborhood pond the HOA had constructed. It was a small but legitimate private dam, engineered and maintained by my family long before the HOA even existed. It served as an irrigation source for local farms. And though the HOA liked to act as if they controlled everything within the neighborhood, they had no authority over that dam. Karen, of course, didn't care about facts or legality. She cared about appearances and control. And to her, my property represented something she couldn't control. So she invented a ridiculous fine to try and bend me into submission. The next day, I went to the HOA office during their scheduled meeting time. The board members sat at the table like a panel of judges. Karen sat at the center, her smug grin already plastered across her face, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "Ah, Mr. Dawson," she said, dragging out my name with that condescending drawl she reserved for people she considered beneath her. "We were just discussing your violation." She tapped the folder in front of her labeled with my address. "You have been assessed a fine for owning an excessive and unapproved water feature that disrupts the uniformity of our community." I laughed out loud, unable to contain it. "Are you insane? That's a reservoir. It's been here since the 1940s. My grandfather built the dam. It's not some unapproved water feature." The other board members shifted uncomfortably. But Karen raised her chin higher. "Regardless, it's unsightly. It attracts mosquitoes. It lowers property values. And most importantly, it doesn't comply with HOA guidelines. You'll pay the fine, or further action will be taken." I leaned across the table and locked eyes with her. "You don't own the water, Karen. You don't own the land. And you sure as hell don't own me. I'm not paying a dime for your fabricated nonsense." For a moment, her smug facade faltered, but she quickly recovered, waving her hand dismissively. "We'll see about that." Her words dripped with venom, but I noticed the flicker of insecurity behind her eyes. She was bluffing, and I knew it. Later that week, I noticed more harassment. Karen started a rumor among the neighborhood that my dam was unsafe, claiming it could burst at any moment and flood the community. She went door to door with a clipboard, collecting signatures on a petition to have the dangerous structure removed. My neighbors, many of whom had lived alongside the reservoir peacefully for decades, were understandably confused. Some signed to avoid conflict with her, while others told me what she was up to directly. One neighbor, old Mr. Stevens, who had been a close friend of my grandfather, warned me, "She's pushing too hard this time, son. But don't let her scare you. That dam is solid. She's just trying to break you." Karen didn't stop there. A few days later, I came home to find bright orange violation notices taped to my mailbox, my front door, even the posts around the dam itself. They were all written in the same officious language, threatening escalating fines if I didn't comply. It was harassment, plain and simple, and I knew she wanted to provoke me. What she didn't realize was that I had something she couldn't control: the flow of water itself. That reservoir wasn't just a piece of land. It was leverage. And when she announced her next move, I knew exactly how I'd use it. One Friday afternoon, I received another HOA announcement slipped under my door. Karen was planning an extravagant garden party that weekend. It's hosted in her immaculate backyard, the kind of event she used to flaunt her self-importance. She had invited the entire HOA board, city officials, and even the mayor. It was her chance to showcase herself as the reigning queen of the neighborhood, the woman who controlled it all. The irony was delicious. Her party would be held on the very weekend she had pushed hardest to humiliate me with her water fines. And that's when the idea hit me. If Karen wanted to fine me for owning too much water, then I'd show her what it really meant to deal with water you couldn't control. I spent Saturday preparing. I walked along the dam, checked the sluice gates, and made sure everything was in working order. This wasn't about causing destruction. It was about teaching her a lesson in humility. My family had built the dam with overflow systems precisely for managing excess water. With just the right timing, I could release enough flow down the irrigation channels to redirect a surge straight through the creek that ran near Karen's backyard. Not enough to cause lasting damage, but certainly enough to wash away her fancy decor, her tables of catered food, and the smug look on her face when she tried to show off her power. The plan was risky, but the thought of Karen shrieking as her carefully manicured garden turned into a muddy mess was too perfect to resist. The day of the party arrived. Karen's backyard was decked out like some kind of country club gala. White tents covered tables laden with food and champagne, string lights hung across the patio, and a live band was tuning up near the hedges. Guests in their finest attire mingled about, sipping drinks and laughing politely at Karen's endless chatter. I stayed out of sight, waiting for the right moment. From my vantage point near the dam, I could hear the faint music drifting on the wind. My hands rested on the lever of the sluice gate, the metal cool beneath my grip. "Too much water," I muttered to myself. a grin tugging at the corners of my mouth. "Let's see how much you like it now, Karen." And with that, I pulled. The gates creaked as they opened, and a surge of water roared forth, rushing down the channel like a released beast. My heart pounded as I imagined the scene unfolding below. The surge would take only minutes to reach Karen's yard. And when it did, her garden party would be drowned in poetic justice.